Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We appreciate you taking 30 minutes out of your day to join us for today's presentation of how to select the right CDP. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group, and our company founder, Tony Byrne, will be on the line with us momentarily to walk us through the heart of today's presentation. But as we get started, I wanted to walk through a couple housekeeping items of note, and also give you a quick background about Real Story Group, as I see that there are a number of new folks on the line with us today, and we certainly are happy to see that, as well as returning customers and some existing subscribers. So again, thanks all for joining us today. So a couple quick housekeeping items. First and foremost, if you have questions at any point during today's presentation, there's a questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Please feel free to enter them in there, and time permitting, we'll get to those at the end of the session. The other thing I want to mention is we are recording today's webinar, so a recording will be made available to all of our subscribers on the line, and then the slides will be available to everyone who's joining us for today's presentation. So keep an eye out for that within the next few days, as our marketing team will get that over to you. But to begin, I do want to mention a couple things about Real Story Group, who we are and what we do. So at heart, we are a research and an analyst firm. What we do is publish detailed evaluations about vendors in digital workplace and digital marketing technology. And the way we evaluate these solutions is a little bit different than you might see with typical analyst firms. We don't talk about the best or worst vendor, but rather what's going to be the right fit for what it is you're trying to do. And within our research, we have detailed scenarios through each of the different markets that we cover, and we have tools where you can actually enter that information in and generate a shortlist that's customized to your specific scenarios and strategic considerations. We also have tools where you can compare the vendors side by side with each other. So if you already have a shortlist in mind, you can skip right to that, as well as an application called RealScore, where you can measure your digital effectiveness and benchmark yourselves against industry peers. Now, there are certain occasions where we'll take a more strategic look and a more hands-on approach to your team, and that's in the form of a consulting engagement where we either will help you through a selection project or through a strategic assessment of your capabilities and help you to develop a roadmap for where you want to go. Now, in terms of where we differ from other analyst firms, I mentioned that we don't rank best or worst vendors, but what's also key and which of critical importance to us is that we don't do any work for the vendors that we cover. We are only on the side of the table of enterprise technology users and buyers. And that's really how we can provide you with a real story about what the solutions do well, but perhaps more importantly, where they could potentially fall short for you. And again, our research is in 9 different areas that you see mapped out here on our trusty vendor map. And you'll notice that we have digital workplace on the top of the map, and digital marketing technology, excuse me, it's reversed. Digital marketing technology on the top half and digital workplace on the bottom. Today, we're going to focus on the dark blue line, which is customer data platforms. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to our company founder, Tony Byrne.
Great, thanks, Scott. So really excited to talk about customer data platforms. This is our newest research. We've been working on this for the last, I'd say, half year, fairly detailed vendor evaluations. And, you know, the idea is really to get beyond this. This is what caused me to found Real Story Group 17 years ago, is this idea that, you know, all you needed to do is go look at these static quadrants and figure out which were the best vendors for you, and then take it and go make a decision. And of course, hopefully by now we all realize this is not the right way to select technology, that you really need to do deeper dives based on your specific circumstances and your specific use cases. And so the goal here today is to tell you the real story about what's going on with customer data platforms. So Let's start, as all analysts should, I think, with some kind of an initial reference model. So there's a lot going on here. I'm going to describe it briefly, but this is a traditional digital marketing engagement reference model. We've been using variations of this to help our subscribers kind of interpret their MarTech stack. And we've been doing this particular model, been iterating on it for about 4 years now. The idea is that you have major channels at the top, major engagement and delivery channels. You have a series of production and interaction delivery services in gray there, like portals, content delivery networks, community, e-commerce, that sort of thing. Then you've got your content and engagement management layer, where you've got, your content, whether it's web content, digital assets, emails, so forth, and then engaging with customers through those systems. And then the interesting thing for us is this area in the purple on the bottom, which is some kind of aggregated interface into your customer data. And for a long time, we talked about this as a customer data backbone. And in fact, we saw many of our larger subscribers actually kind of build some of these themselves in a homegrown sort of way. And the use case is obvious, that you need really a unified view of gold or definitive customer data and segments that could be used across all of your channels and all of your systems, rather than being stuck in a particular silo. But of course, to get that information, you often have to aggregate it and clean it and disambiguate it from a variety of different sources. And as you can imagine, it was hard to do that in a kind of a manual way, although we saw some large enterprises, particularly in the B2C space, build essentially these customer data backbones from scratch using a variety of different tools, and could be effective at it. Because this need was so ubiquitous, the marketplace has noticed, and instead we've seen the rise of kind of packaged marketing-friendly solutions, as opposed to sort of heavily technology-oriented solutions to do this, and thus the CDP, or customer data platform market, has grown up in the last, certainly going back, some of this stuff goes back 10 years, certainly in the last 3 to 5 years, seen a veritable explosion in terms of the number of tool sets and vendors that have entered this space. We'll talk about these vendors a little bit later, but the idea is that now you have, rather than building some of this just from scratch, a lot of this plumbing has already been put together to you in a packaged customer data platform, usually delivered from the cloud, that's able to integrate both with your upstream data sources and then activate that data downstream through your different engagement channels. And so, this is an almost universal need, particularly in the B2C space, but also increasingly in B2B as well, to have this sort of definitive gold source of your customer and prospect data that wasn't tied into any particular individual engagement silo. And so what's happened here is that the digital marketing stack is kind of evolving, and CDPs are part of this evolution where, you still have engagement channels, you still have interaction delivery services. What's happening is that CRM, which is, customer care and Salesforce automation, is becoming less of a data store and more, particularly on the B2C side, more of an interactive service. And then what we're doing increasingly, and this is particular on large enterprises, is to do omni-channel engagement. You've got to have some channel independent and what we're calling enterprise foundation services, right? And these are enterprise foundation services for marketing engagement. And customer data platforms having the, over on the left, the definitive prospect and customer data and segments, right? But then also increasingly, organizations are abstracting out campaign management and journey orchestration into a separate layer so they can do omni-channel campaigns and support omni-channel journeys. Obviously, analytics is something you don't want to necessarily bind just to a particular silo. You need at an enterprise level a lot of capabilities that you see there, and potentially multiple systems around dashboards, reporting, and visualization, predictive modeling. Content warehouse, which is a concept that we're sort of incubating here, this notion of being able to take some of your core content outside of a particular engagement channel so that you can manage and distribute it and derive it across different contexts. And then, of course, identity and access management. So customer data platforms is part and parcel of a broader trend towards kind of narrowing and simplifying your engagement services and moving some of the complexity with respect to data and orchestration lower in your stack so that you can do it across segments. Now, what's interesting about this from a CDP standpoint is that sometimes some CDP vendors will also incorporate other services within their platform. And so this becomes a scope issue for you. Of course, this is not a new story in digital marketing where there's a lot of overlap between what one vendor does and what another vendor does. Vendors sort of aggregating different services across boundaries, right? So in some cases, your CDP may offer campaign and journey orchestration services. Since they're that close to the data, they're like, well, let us then manage the campaigns and journeys. Very often, they may have analytics capabilities that if you don't already have an analytics-oriented data warehouse, they may provide these services, particularly around predictive modeling, which is, of course, interesting when you're talking about segments and marketing. Some even have some email services and will ship with their own email service provider. We would typically not recommend that, but we understand why a CDP might do that if you don't already have that capability. Maybe for some customers that works. In practice, we tend to suggest a more separation of concerns, that you have these separated channel delivery services and engagement management services, and then you separate that from your enterprise foundation layer, which is more data and orchestration oriented. But that speaks to kind of what's happening in the marketplace. And part of what you'll need to do as you look at selecting CDP software is decide which sort of these ancillary services do I want or not want to be able to include in my, in my CDP selection. So now let's look at CDP use cases, because this relates to that, right? And we identify in our evaluations 9 potential use cases. The key thing for you is to try to figure out your sense for priorities here. In other words, which are the ones that are going to be more or less important to you on your sort of journey here. So let's go across the different rows. First, we have, advanced marketing master data management, or advanced, customer data management. So all CDPs at a baseline provide basic data management, including reconciling single customer records from multiple different data sources, typically ingesting and cleaning that data and so forth. But you have a number of vendors who have very advanced capabilities here around even sort of virtual data warehouse capabilities, being able to do more than just segments, but actually have physically distinct data sets and that sort of thing. Outbound marketing campaign support. So this is integrating with your email and social channels and connecting to them directly and sending them data and segments, and then receiving back, of course, certain activity records. So that's obviously a critical use case. Predictive analytics is something you'll see in some CDPs. Maybe you want it there. Maybe you already have another data warehouse where you're doing it. Online personalization and experience optimization. So this is typically about supporting your website personalization efforts. And there's a variant of this next to that around e-commerce recommendations and optimization. So being able to support sort of next best offer and that sort of thing. Another scenario is around omni-channel and offline aggregation. So being able to support, on the one hand, a broad array of digital delivery channels, including mobile, but also things like voice and even direct mail, right? 7th scenario in the lower left is around real-time behavior analysis. This is obviously very tricky, potentially very powerful. This is being able to reason against real-time information that's coming in. So at this point, your platform really is becoming a runtime environment. It's important to understand that, but then reasoning against that and making decisions about what happens next. B2B support is interesting, kind of a new thing in this space, historically oriented more towards B2C, but in B2B, you have a notion of some kind of an organizational unit as a first-class object as opposed to just the individual customer. And so that's obviously important in certain contexts. And then last but not least, the 9th scenario is support for digital advertising. This is also relatively new. Historically, I think organizations have tended to use DMPs here and other things, but if you have first-party data, you may want to integrate that and use that to help you drive any advertising that you're doing. So different vendors are going to stress different use cases. Of course, almost every vendor is likely to say, oh, we can do all of this stuff, but the reality is that some are better at one than another, right? And so the key thing is for you as a customer to understand, hey, which ones of these are really significant for us? So let's take the case of, this is actually the IBM Universal Behavioral Exchange offer. So this is one of the tools that we evaluate in our research, and this is what it does relative. So, you know, 1 Harvey ball means it kind of does it. 2 means it, you know, when you see the half slice there, that means it's okay at it. 3 would mean that it really excels at it. So IBM's UBX product is, you can see here, is kind of you know, can support a number of scenarios, but not necessarily all that well. Since it's really kind of a container for exploiting a number of Watson services, as you can imagine, some of the things that it's going to excel at are around predictive analytics and e-commerce recommendations, and to some extent, real-time behavioral analysis. The issue with IBM that you'll see with all of the bigger suite vendors is it tends to want to integrate and aggregate with its own suite of digital marketing tools, and is typically a little bit less adept at becoming a more vendor or platform agnostic CDP, in which you tend to see more from the more pure play vendors. So this is use cases and use case match. Then the other thing that Real Story Group always looks at is strategic considerations, which we break out into vendor, product, and ecosystem. So from a vendor perspective, IBM is a fairly robust vendor. They obviously have their issues sometimes around strategy and organization, but you know, they have pretty strong customer support, a strong professional services arm that actually is familiar with the UBX platform, and it's a relatively, you know, viable and stable platform. We're questioning some of their strategy here around the way that their CDP offering is striped across a number of different IBM offerings here, and that makes it confusing and difficult to really, for you as a customer even, to have a unified, coherent environment. The product itself, in terms of the roadmap, the technical modernity, and the value for money, this tends to be a little bit weaker here for a variety of different reasons. And then, you know, with respect to the ecosystem, IBM is somewhat of a differentiator in the space that they actually have channel partners who can implement this, but relatively weak in terms of community strength and third-party add-ons. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a little bit of a different story than you see from most of the other pure play CDP vendors, where we tend to see the vendors a little bit weaker and immature. The ecosystem tends to be somewhat weak and immature, but the product intangibles tend to be very, very strong. IBM has somewhat of a different story here. So obviously these strategic considerations are important, and what we'll do in a minute is show how these then match up against your scenario fit for helping you drive, you know, what's a good vendor shortlist for picking this. So again, we have these kind of 2 sets of vendors. You have the suite vendors who tend to, none of them really have a proper CDP, but they have tool sets that are kind of masquerading as CDPs, and that they would want to sell you if you came to them and said you needed a CDP. So they tend to be CDP-like, and they tend to focus on integration with their own platform, their own kind of channel-based engagement services, as opposed to being more channel agnostic or vendor agnostic. And you have a variety of pure play platforms, and on the surface, they purport to do the same things. I think if you dig into our research, you'll find that from a scenario perspective, they differ quite substantially. So how do you pick the right one, or even get to a short list? And so, you know, our big mantra here for all of our subscribers is to apply design thinking to this whole process. My colleague Jared and I wrote a book about this last year, available through Rosenfeld Media, called The Right Way to Select Technology. And the idea here is to apply more agile design thinking approaches to this whole process, where you build a team, you actually test the tools, you iterate as you get to know the technologies and your own needs better, and you make it an adaptive process so that you're not locked into a particular approach. And as you learn more about the technology and your own needs, you can then drill down a little bit differently. So how do you then go about selecting the right CDP? By the way, some great questions are coming in, and if you have other questions, we'll definitely have time to answer them. So feel free to use the GoToWebinar control panel and ask. Okay. So you definitely want to build an interdisciplinary selection team. Obviously, your data people and data analytics people, very important, but obviously security is important. And then your marketing people who are actually going to be using this technology. So one of the things about these, particularly from the pure play vendors, is that these are supposed to be marketing friendly, marketing capable tools. Those sometimes are famous last words to say that something is marketing friendly and then actually have a marketing person actually use it and deploy it readily in their day-to-day work, sometimes two different things, but obviously something then you want to test with real marketers. Then in terms of building a short list, we would recommend building what we call a real quadrant. So not a magic quadrant, but a real quadrant where you select the scenarios and weight the scenarios that are important to you, and you weight the strategic considerations that are important to you, and then based on RSG's evaluations, it actually outputs a custom quadrant that gives you a short list, or I would argue for this space, a long list to then investigate. And so part of that investigation is to then, do some additional research and vetting. Obviously, our research can help you there. Then send to 6 to 8 vendors, maybe even I might say even a broader list for this marketplace, an RFP that's based on actual user stories. Then based on those responses, bring some in for demos, again, based on your user stories. And then finally, bring 2 in for a bake-off, again, based on user stories, where you actually get hands-on before you actually select the vendor. So we've seen this methodology work very, very well in other markets, and we think it really has legs in terms of picking the right CDP as well. So in terms of this whole process, what you really want are testable narratives. The temptation, particularly I think with CDPs, is to build all these checklists. And the vendors have seen these checklists, and usually they can check most of the boxes, if not all of them. The key thing is really to tell narrative stories, which is, as you know, a key part of almost any agile methodology, where you're describing how a marketer or an analyst, or in some cases an IT person, will actually use this technology. What will they do with it? How are they going to deploy it, and what systems are they going to connect to, and what are your expectations about what's going to happen? And then this then gives you test cases which the vendor can respond to, both in their RFP, and then if they make it to the demo round, and then if they make it to the POC round, to actually show you how to execute this hands-on. The point about having 3 rounds then is also gives you a chance to adapt those stories as you get smarter. But you definitely want a competitive proof of concept or bake-off. I can't believe how many large organizations buy technology without even trying it. So you want real scenarios, real data, your people actually trying it out in a real environment. This also gives you a chance to negotiate fees and terms and all kinds of other important things. Now, this is tricky. It's a little bit more labor intensive for CDPs because you might have to open up non-production instances of some of your data sources and some of your engagement channels to be able to integrate with. So you need to involve your security people, your systems people, certainly your marketing teams. This requires a little bit of thought and planning, but it's so much better than just essentially buying on a wing and a prayer and assuming that it's all going to work out for you. You don't want to watch the salesperson drive a new car around the parking lot. You want to get in that car and drive it yourself. So that's what this is really all about. All right, so key takeaways, and then Scott's going to talk about next step as I go through your questions here. So CDPs are increasingly a foundational layer in the MarTech stack, especially for B2C companies. Obviously, you need to really put some thinking into the data models, the functional scope of what you want this technology to do, and what are your real priorities? Because there's a lot of potential here, but what do you really want to light up in the first year or two? CDP marketplace is highly fragmented and getting more so. So we cover 20 vendors right now. We're going to be bumping that up to 30 by next year. So you want to cast a wide net and focus on specific use cases. And one of the things we get into in our research is the somewhat consistent immaturity of both the vendors and their ecosystem. Now, immaturity isn't always necessarily a bad thing. The flip side to this is that they're innovative, they're using modern technologies, but if you're a serious enterprise customer, obviously you have to mitigate against that. Definitely want to try before you buy, and you can do that through an agile-oriented selection process where you have adaptive testing based on your specific narratives. So if you want the inside nitty-gritty on these tools and how they compare, I invite you to go visit our research and certainly try out a free sample that you can download today. And then if you have any questions about that, Scott can talk to you about next steps. and he'll take a minute doing that, and then we'll get right to your questions.
Great, thanks, Tony. And yes, as Tony mentioned, certainly go on our site and try out the CDP research, along with, you can take a look at any of the other samples from our digital technology research. There are 9 that you can download on our site, and we welcome you to do that. You can also actually try out the tools that Tony mentioned, such as Real Quadrant, and generating a customized shortlist, and seeing the real-time application where you can compare the vendors side by side with each other. So try those out. It's sort of a demo type site that you can use, but if you'd like to see more of a personalized demonstration, just let us know. We'd be happy to schedule a behind the scenes tour, look at the Real Story Group subscriber experience. We do have another webinar coming up October 3rd that's going to talk about the updates to our vendor map that we showed you at the beginning of the webinar. So certainly we invite you to join us for that. And it looks like there are some questions. So Tony, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, so Dan is asking, have you looked at Session M? And we have, and it's on the, it's one of the, I believe it's one of the vendors that we evaluate today. And so, you can definitely follow up with us with more specific questions about that. Amit is asking a really great question about the bake-off process for a CDP. Setting up an end-to-end data pipeline from ingestion to processing to aggregation to insights is a lengthy process. Is it feasible to do a bake-off in a time-boxed manner? So some of these CDPs may need to be staggered a little bit. I mean, some of these POCs where you're initially, maybe you're spending a week doing some ingestion, and then you have the vendor come back a couple weeks later and you start talking about activation. The key thing here, I think, as you mentioned, is to try to do this in an end-to-end process, but maybe you're not doing a full implementation. So maybe you're only doing a couple of data sources with respect to the ingest, and only a couple of channel sources, channel target destinations with respect to some of the activation. This definitely is a different sort of exercise than, say, doing a POC with a digital asset management system, which can usually be done in a neat 3 to 5 days. Having said that, the good news is that many of these solutions are cloud-based. The vendors brag about how quickly they can get you up and running. The interfaces they claim are point and click, and so this is an opportunity to figure out really just how point and click are these systems. And I don't want to underestimate some of the level of complexity here, particularly about getting access to some of your internal systems while you're still in kind of, selection mode. So there is some complexity there, but you really do want to try before you buy. There's a couple questions about the difference between a CDP and a DMP, and we have an advisory paper out about this. CDP is usually around first-party data, and so it holds PII, or personal, identifiable information, and it's data that you own and nominally you don't share with anyone else, whereas DMPs tend to have more aggregated third-party data. And so the two of them often do relate. A DMP can be a data source for a CDP and vice versa. And so we know of customers who have used both, for example, in the context of supporting digital advertising. So that's a great question, Kevin had a similar question. Michael's saying Adobe would say target, right? So Adobe would say that target is where they do their personalization, and then campaign is where they do their journey orchestration. Neither of those are CDPs. So if you already had those two and you were happy with those two, then you wouldn't necessarily need or want those services in your CDP. That essentially campaign and target would be sources of activation around the data and the segments that you already have. Now, this gets complicated because since both campaign and target and other journey orchestration and campaign management systems grew up outside of the context of CDPs, that sometimes they're expecting those data sources and segments to be local, and they're not. You now have them at an enterprise level, and so there's integration issues. And we have definitely seen integrations, and particularly integration challenges, particularly with the Adobe stack, because Adobe is expecting on the front end to be getting that data from Adobe, and it's not getting that data in those segments from Adobe anymore. So there have been some challenges kind of mapping there, and this is part of the growing pains of the modern MarTech stack. So I think that let me just double check that wraps up all of the questions that we have. And Sammy is pointing out that Adobe is building this as part of Experience Cloud instead of Campaign Target. So Adobe is building this actually in its what they're calling just Adobe Cloud. So they've made some acquisitions and they're doing some work and building some capabilities outside of it. But clearly the targets are its own experience, and its own experience delivery channels are is the assumption is that that's the primary activation. Whereas if you're not using a lot of Adobe tools on the front end, then what Adobe is building with respect to data aggregation probably doesn't make sense. Even if you do have a lot of Adobe technology on the front end, you still may not want to use what they're building, because you can see from our research it isn't really a pro forma CDP. Okay, so that takes us about a minute or two late, but really happy to be on board with you, excited about this research. Happy to entertain any further questions that you have via that the email or the phone numbers that you see on the screen in front of you. So thanks for dropping by today. For Scott Dill and myself, Tony Byrne, best wishes for the rest of your week and your weekend. And from Real Story Group, so long.